This is a clay tablet pulled from the Iraqi desert, pressed with wedge-shaped marks more than 5,000 years ago. We can read it. It records grain, debts, the names of gods who have not been worshipped since before Rome existed. We can read what these people wrote. We cannot say with any confidence who they were. That is the problem at the center of this story. A civilization this foundational should have left a clear ancestral trail behind it. It did not. I came across the Sumerian origin question while researching something else entirely, and I could not let it go, because their language refuses to connect to any other language on Earth. They invented writing, the wheel, the city, the law code, the very idea of dividing an hour into 60 minutes, and then they vanished as a distinct people while their inventions outlived them by 5,000 years. Recent ancient DNA work has finally entered the record. What it revealed was not what anyone expected. Start with the land, because the land is the first thing that makes the story refuse to make sense. Southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and the Euphrates run down into the Persian Gulf, is a country of clay and reeds. There are no forests worth the name. There is almost no stone. There is no metal in the ground worth speaking of. Everything a civilization needs to build itself, every beam and block and ingot, has to be carried in from somewhere else. And the two rivers that define the place do not behave the way the Nile behaves 1,000 miles to the west. The Nile floods on a schedule. It floods at roughly the same time every year, deposits its silt, and pulls back. A farmer in ancient Egypt could set his calendar by it. The Tigris and the Euphrates do nothing of the kind. They flood without warning. They change course without warning. And when they move, they turn whole inhabited regions into uninhabitable swamp inside a single season. A village that had stood on a riverbank for generations could wake up one morning to find the river half a mile away, the fields cracked and salting under the sun. This was by almost any measure the worst possible place to build the first great civilization, and it is exactly where the Sumerians built it. How they came to be there at all is one of the genuine unsolved questions of human history. The first clue did not come from a tomb or a monument. It came from their language. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate. It is related to nothing. No parent, no surviving cousins, no known connection to any other tongue spoken anywhere on the planet, then or now. Linguists have searched for more than 150 years for a sister language, anything that might point home, and they have not found one. The closest comparison is Basque, the language of a pocket of northern Spain, which is also an isolate, also unrelated to anything around it. Sumerian sits in that same lonely category, a language with no family, and the strangeness goes deeper than that. The names of the great Sumerian cities, places like Nippur and Lagash, are not Sumerian words. The names of the rivers and the lakes themselves were borrowed from somewhere else. Even the core vocabulary of farming, the words for plow, for farmer, for the act of sowing seed, came from an earlier language that was already there before the Sumerians arrived to claim it. Linguists call this older substrate the Proto-Euphratean tongue, and almost nothing else of it survives. It is a shadow under the Sumerian language, glimpsed only in the words the Sumerians themselves never bothered to translate, because the things being named were already in use when they got there. There were settlements at these sites long before the Sumerians ever arrived to claim them. The mounds we dig today contain layer upon layer of earlier occupation, going back thousands of years, to a time when these were small farming villages with no writing, no kings, no temples reaching toward the sky. Someone was living there. Someone was naming the rivers. Someone was breaking the soil with the first plows. And whoever they were not speaking Sumerian. So the picture that should have been simple is already breaking down. The first great civilization built itself on land that should have made the project impossible, using a language that points to no homeland, in cities that already had names, with farming words borrowed from a people who came before them. Pull all of that together, and you are left with a single uncomfortable question. If the land could not give them, and the language could not give them, and the cities themselves had been named by someone else, then where had the Sumerians actually come from? The trail we should be following points everywhere and nowhere at once. The theories about where they came from have never stopped multiplying. For more than 150 years, scholars have looked at the same scarce evidence and reached completely different conclusions, and the field today is no closer to agreement than it was when the first cuneiform tablets were translated in the 1800s. Walk through them in order, and the trouble becomes obvious almost immediately. The first theory is that the Sumerians were native all along. In this version, they are the direct descendants of the older Ubaid and Uruk cultures, the farming people who had been living in southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years already, who had built the first irrigation channels, raised the first mud brick temples, and quietly developed the foundations of city life long before anyone wrote any of it down. There would be no migration to explain because there would be no arrival. The Sumerians in this reading simply are the people of the marshes, grown into something larger. It is a clean solution, and it has the virtue of needing the fewest moving parts. It also leaves the language problem entirely unanswered. The Sumerians themselves told a different story. According to their own myths, they had come by sea from a paradise island called Dilmun, the place we now call Bahrain, lying out in the Persian Gulf. Dilmun was the home of the gods in their oldest poems, a green place without sickness or old age, where the waters rose sweet from the ground. Archaeologists really did find traces of Sumerian activity on Bahrain when they went looking. The trouble is the timing. Those traces appear in Mesopotamia far too early for that account to hold. Dilmun was a trading partner of the Sumerian cities, not their ancestral homeland. The myth, in other words, is a memory of contact, dressed up across the centuries into something grander. Others have placed the homeland further afield, and this is where the trail truly splinters. Some put their origin in the Indus Valley far to the east, in modern Pakistan, pointing to faint resemblances in trade goods and bead designs. Others place them in Anatolia to the north, in the highlands of modern Turkey, on the grounds that some of the earliest farming towns in the world stood there. Others again look to the Caucasus Mountains, or to Arabia, or even to Tibet. Every one of these theories has a hole in it. The Indus Valley civilization itself rose later than the early Sumerian cities, which makes the direction of travel hard to defend. Anatolia and the Caucasus leave no trail of physical objects matching the Mesopotamian record. The Arabian and Tibetan ideas rest on guesses that fall apart the moment they are tested against the dates. And there is a deeper problem running underneath all of them. Most of these claims rest on the faint resemblance of one word to another, a Sumerian root that sounds vaguely like a word in some distant tongue, a place name that echoes a place name. The whole exercise is an exercise in linguistic hearing, and human ears are very good at finding patterns that are not really there. The archaeology, the actual physical evidence pulled out of the ground, does not back almost any of it up. There is even a possibility that turns the whole exercise inside out. What if some of these distant locations were not the Sumerian homeland at all, but only places where Sumerian travelers, traders, or scattered survivors ended up much later, after the great upheavals at the end of their world? In which case, we would be reading the wreckage of their later movements and mistaking it for their beginning. Looking at the splash they made on the way out and calling it the place they came from. So we are left with this. 150 years of theories, none of them resting on solid ground. a homeland that points everywhere and nowhere. The one thing that might finally settle the question was never written on any tablet. It was buried in the bones. Before we ask what happened to these people, it is worth understanding exactly what they built, because the scale of it is staggering. Somewhere around the turn of the 4th millennium into the 3rd, something extraordinary happened in that landscape of mud and reeds. Ordinary settlements began to swell into the world's first true cities. Not towns, not large villages. Cities in the full sense of the word, with tens of thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder behind walls of mud brick, fed by fields they could not see from their own doorsteps. The mechanism behind it was water. To master the unpredictable rivers, the Sumerians built a vast network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, and they maintained that network with an obsessive, generation-spanning effort. A city's power scaled directly with the size and efficiency of its irrigation system. The richer the canals, the larger the harvest. The larger the harvest, the more people the city could feed. That single fact reshaped human society from the ground up. A surplus of food meant that not everyone had to farm. And so, for the first time in history, the world had artisans, merchants, priests, and scribes. People whose entire working lives were spent at a wheel or a forge or a clay tablet, fed by the labor of others. The people who organized the water, who managed the canals and the granaries and the labor gangs, rose above the rest and became the first ruling elite. Kingship, in the modern sense, that whole institution, begins here in the practical business of telling people when to dig. Then came the inventions, and the list is almost difficult to believe. They built the plow, which made farming efficient enough to free still more hands for other work. They built the wheel, used first to carry the statues of gods in religious processions, and later mounted onto the first war chariots, pulled not by horses but by donkeys. They built with arches and with columns, when no one else on earth had thought to. Their ziggurats, vast stepped temple towers, climbed toward the sky in tiers of sun-dried brick. Some of them so well built that their ruins still rise above the southern Iraqi plain today. Their minds reached just as far as their hands. They invented a counting system based on the number 60, and you are still living inside it. It is why an hour has 60 minutes. It is why a day has 24 hours, split into 2 cycles of 12. It is why a circle has 360 degrees. Every time you check a clock or read a compass, you are using a piece of Sumerian mathematics. They could solve quadratic equations on clay tablets in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle more than 1,000 years before a Greek named Pythagoras was given the credit for it. They compiled the first catalogs of the stars, tracked the wandering paths of the planets, and learned to predict eclipses of the sun and the moon with enough accuracy to write them down in advance. They divided time into a 7-day week and named each day for a body in the sky, a habit we have never abandoned in any major calendar since. They wrote down the earliest law codes we know of, centuries before Hammurabi, setting prices and punishments in careful columns of cuneiform. They had courts. They had contracts. They had property law. And in their quieter hours, they brewed beer so thick they drank it through straws to filter out the grain, and they worshipped a goddess of brewing while they did it. They wrote love poems. They wrote drinking songs. They wrote the first epic in any human language. Here is what makes all of this so strange. A people who engineered the foundations of the modern world, who left behind buildings and writing and mathematics that still shape how we live, should be the easiest civilization in history to trace. Instead, they are the hard. Of everything the Sumerians built, one invention matters more than the rest, both for them and for us, and it is the one that should have solved the mystery. The development of writing was slow, unfolding across thousands of years, and it began with something utterly mundane. It began with accounting. Once people produced surplus food and began trading it across distances, they needed a way to keep records, a way to remember who owed what to whom, how many sheep had gone into the temple stores, how many measures of grain had left them. So across the ancient Near East, going back almost 10,000 years, they used small clay tokens. One token shaped like a cone might stand for one measure of grain. One token shaped like a disc might stand for one sheep. 10 tokens of the same kind meant 10 of the thing. A simple, tactile system of bookkeeping that worked perfectly well for the small economies of small villages. Then, around 3,300 years before the Common Era, officials in the city of Uruk had a brilliant idea. Instead of storing the tokens in sealed clay envelopes, why not press them into the soft outside of the envelope and record the information directly on its surface? Better still, why bother with the tokens at all? Why not just draw the shape with the stylus? That small change lit the fuse. From there, it accelerated. People began scratching simple pictures into the clay. A sheep, a loaf, a person. Each sign standing for a thing in the world. Then came the decisive leap, and it is one of the great cognitive moments in human history. The Sumerians realized that a symbol could represent a sound rather than an object. The sign for the word arrow, for instance, could now be used anywhere that same sound appeared, regardless of meaning, in the way a modern child might draw an eye to mean the word eye. And suddenly, a writing system could capture the full complexity of spoken language, grammar, tense, the names of people, abstract ideas like justice and grief and ownership. Scribes pressed a reed stylus into wet clay at an angle, leaving wedge-shaped marks, which is why we call the script cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. And it did not stay confined to Sumer. It was adopted by the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Elamites, the Hittites. Each people took the wedge shapes and bent them to fit their own languages. It became the operating system of the entire ancient Near East, used for more than 3,000 years across more languages than we use the Latin alphabet for today. Now here is the forensic turn. Clay, as it happens, is almost immortal. Stone weathers, papyrus rots, parchment burns. But a tablet of sun-dried clay, especially one accidentally baked hard in the fire that destroyed its city, can sit in the ground for 5,000 years and emerge legible. More than 1 million cuneiform tablets have survived into the present day, and archaeologists are still pulling new ones out of the ground in southern Iraq and northern Syria. Whole libraries of them, whole archives. Because of them, we know these people in extraordinary detail. We know their trade deals and their lawsuits. We know their myths and their love poems. We know the contents of their storerooms and the names of their gods, the prices of their cattle, and the complaints of their schoolboys. There is a tablet from around 1800 before the Common Era, written by a customer named Nani, complaining bitterly to a merchant called Ea Nasir about the poor quality of copper ingots delivered to his home. The world's oldest surviving customer complaint, preserved in clay. And that is exactly what makes them so maddening. We can read their grocery lists. We can read their poetry. We cannot read their ancestry. They are, in a real sense, the best documented mystery in the ancient world. A people who wrote down almost everything except the one thing we most want to know, which is who they actually were. To answer that, you cannot read the tablets. You have to read the genome. Reading the genome of the Sumerians is harder than it sounds, and for a long time it was simply impossible. Ancient DNA is fragile. It survives best in cold, dry conditions, in caves and permafrost, in places where the molecule can sit undisturbed in something close to a deep freeze. The climate of Mesopotamia is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving it. Heat and humidity break the molecule down into shorter and shorter fragments until nothing usable is left. A skeleton that would yield perfect genetic data in a Siberian cave will yield almost nothing in southern Iraq. So for decades, there was a strange silence at the center of the field. The tablets talked endlessly. The bones said nothing. We could reconstruct the prices of barley in the 3rd dynasty of Ur. We could read the names of kings who had been dead for 40 centuries. We could not say what these people looked like at the level of the cell. The biology of the first civilization was simply a blank space, and most researchers assumed it would stay that way. Then the technology caught up. New laboratory methods for extracting and amplifying tiny degraded fragments of ancient DNA, developed in the last 10 or 15 years, finally began to work on remains from the wider Near East. Skeletons from Iran, from Anatolia, from the Levant, and eventually from Mesopotamia itself started yielding readable signals. The data is still thin compared to what we have from Europe. The samples are still few, but the bones are no longer silent. And what they pulled out of the noise quietly rearranged the whole story. The expectation, built up over more than a century of theorizing, was that the Sumerians would turn out to be a single distinct population, a people who had swept in from somewhere else and replaced whoever had been there before. That is what the mysterious arrivals from Dilmun, from the Indus Valley, from the Caucasus, had always implied. A clean migration, a founding people, a discrete genetic signature you could point to on a map and say, there, they began there. The genetic picture is nothing like that. What the DNA reveals is a fusion. The Sumerians carried the ancestry of the local Mesopotamian farmers, the descendants of the older Ubad and Uruk cultures who had been working the marshes for thousands of years. Blended with that local foundation was movement out of the neighboring regions, the highlands of the Zagros Mountains to the east, where pastoralists had been herding goats and sheep for millennia, populations to the north in the hills of Anatolia, and further west, the lands of the Levant, the corridor that runs down the Mediterranean coast toward Egypt. And that single finding reaches back and explains every loose thread we left hanging. It explains why the cities already had names when the Sumerians arrived. It explains why the words for plow and farmer and seed were borrowed from an older tongue. It explains why settlements sat on those sites before any Sumerian did. The Sumerians were not strangers who landed on an empty shore. They were what happened when several streams of people met in the same river valley and merged into something new, generation by generation, until a population emerged that was no longer any of its parents. The question we had been asking all along, where did they come from, was the wrong question. The answer was never a single place. It was a process of mixing. The language remains its own stubborn puzzle, because a tongue can outlive the ancestry of the people who first spoke it. The isolate is not fully resolved by any of this, and it is worth being honest about the limits. The samples are still few, the bones are still scarce, the conclusions are still provisional, and the field is still moving. But the shape of the answer has changed. If the Sumerians did not arrive from nowhere, then their vanishing demands an explanation too. A people assembled from many streams does not simply disappear. So, where did they go? The disappearance did not begin with a catastrophe. It began with a neighbor. For centuries, the Sumerians shared Mesopotamia with the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who had settled mostly to the north, and over time the two cultures bled into one another in everything from religion to government. Akkadians took Sumerian gods and gave them Akkadian names. Sumerian scribes wrote down Akkadian loanwords in their tablets without remarking on it. They were already merging long before anyone forced the issue. Then someone forced the issue. In the late 24th century BCE, a man named Sargon rose to power. The story of his beginning is half legend. The tale of a baby placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the river, found and raised by a gardener, eventually rising to become cupbearer to the king he would one day overthrow. The history is firmer. He seized the throne of Kish and launched a campaign that pulled the squabbling Sumerian city-states under a single crown. For the first time, his empire stretched from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean, the first true empire the world had seen. He installed governors and stationed garrisons across conquered land, destroyed the kingdom of Ebla in modern Syria, and captured the Elamite capital of Susa in the east. His grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed further still, took the title King of the Four Corners of the world, and declared himself a living god. That golden age was brief. The blow came from the east, from the Gutians, a tribal people out of the Zagros Mountains who began raiding the cities, and around 2,200 took the sacred city of Nippur. What followed is often called Mesopotamia's first dark age. The Gutians were mountain people with no understanding of the delicate irrigation that kept the river valley alive. The canals failed. Agriculture collapsed. Cities emptied. Only in the remote southern marshes, hard to reach and easy to ignore, did the old Sumerian way of life carry on, more or less undisturbed. And here's the thing worth noticing. Everything happening on the surface, the conquest, the intermarriage, the slow absorption of one people into another, was the same process the genome had already recorded, only now playing out on the page of recorded history. The fusion that made the Sumerians was still running. They were not being wiped out and replaced by some foreign population. They were dissolving into the very peoples the DNA shows they were already partly made of. The boundary between Sumerian and Akkadian was thinning year by year. The Gutians were eventually driven out, and the south rose one final time under a king named Ur-Nammu, the founder of what we now call the Third Dynasty of Ur. He reunified Sumer and Akkad under one rule, raised the great ziggurat of Ur, a vast stepped temple to the moon god whose ruins still rise above the southern Iraqi plain today. He restored the canals, built a centralized bureaucracy, and ran the provinces on a rotating tax system in which each province supplied the treasury for a single month of the year. The famous Sumerian king list was compiled in this period, a political document meant to bind the new dynasty to ancient and even mythical kings stretching back before the flood. But one detail gives the whole revival away. The rulers deliberately restored Sumerian as the official language of administration and religion, even though Akkadian was already the language people actually spoke in the street. You do not have to restore a living thing. The language was becoming a relic, kept alive on purpose, because it was no longer alive on its own. Then the slow death set in. Centuries of over-irrigation had poisoned the soil with salt. Crop yields fell, and farmland was abandoned across the south. The Amorites pressed in from the west, and the Elamites from the east. In the year 2004 BCE, the Elamites stormed and sacked the city of Ur itself. Here's the thing that stays with me after weeks inside this material. The story of the Sumerians is almost always told as a mystery of origins. A people who came from nowhere and vanished into nothing, leaving only their inventions behind. The DNA tells a different story. It tells of a people who were never a single migrating tribe at all, but a fusion of several, which is exactly why the question of where they came from never had a clean answer. It tells of a civilization that did not so much die as dissolve into its neighbors, its conquerors, and its heirs. Their language survived as a sacred tongue for nearly 2,000 more years. Their mathematics, their law, their writing, their gods were absorbed whole and carried forward into every civilization that followed. They vanished as a people. The thread they started never broke.